American Comics. Kamen Rider who started from behind the scenes. Chapter 21. In the real world, the small mirror that Tony Stark had placed earlier flashed. Tony Stark walked out of the mirror, but before he could stand firm, he felt a tingling sensation all over his body, causing him to fall to the ground. No, I can't just pass out here. Feeling the pain in his body, Tony knew how much damage he had suffered from the previous battle. So when he felt his consciousness becoming increasingly blurred, Tony struggled to take out a cell phone from his pocket. After Tony Stark sent a message through his cell phone, he could no longer control himself and passed out. After a long time, another car drove up to the outside of the dilapidated building. The person who got out of the car was Tony's secretary, Pepper Potts. It turned out that the message Tony had just sent was to Pepper Potts. How could Tony come to such a place, and he only sent me an address? After parking the car, Pepper went into the dilapidated building. Although she couldn't understand the location of the address Tony sent her, she put down her work and rushed here out of worry. While looking at the location on her phone, Pepper walked carefully in the dilapidated building. At this moment, Pepper noticed a person lying on the ground in the distance. This is Tony. After Pepper got a little closer, she found that the person lying on the ground was Tony, who had sent her a message before, and she couldn't help but shout. After Pepper finished shouting, she didn't care about the danger that might happen nearby, and hurried to Tony. Pepper helped Tony up and shouted to Tony. Tony, wake up, what happened to you? But no matter how Pepper shouted, Tony did not wake up. It turned out that after the battle with the locust monster, Tony's body was seriously injured. In order to heal Tony's contracted beast put Tony into a deep sleep to heal his wounds. Seeing that Tony could not be woken up, and Pepper also found that Tony had many bruises and wounds on his body. This made Pepper dare not hesitate any longer, and she picked up Tony by herself. Step by step, she walked to the car and went. Tony, don't worry, I'll take you to the hospital now, you'll be fine. Hospital. Tony was resting on the bed, while the attending doctor and Pepper were talking. After the attending doctor carefully read the medical report in his hand, he said to Pepper. This is incredible, Miss Pepper. Has Mr. Stark undergone some special genetic modification surgery? What does this mean? This made Xiao Lijiao beside her unable to understand, and she asked the doctor a question directly. Miss Pepper, I hope you won't be surprised by what I'm going to say next. This is the data chart we just obtained from scanning Mr. Stark's body. After saying that, the attending doctor handed the report in his hand to Pepper and continued. According to our scan results, Mr. Stark's muscle fibers, bones and other aspects of his body are evolving at an unimaginable speed. Chili subconsciously took the report and read it. After listening to the attending doctor's words, she said. What adverse effects will this have, and can Tony's current injuries be healed? Miss Pepper, don't worry. If it was an ordinary person, he would have died long ago. But with Mr. Stark's current physical condition, I believe he can be completely cured within a month. At this point, the attending doctor showed a difficult expression on his face. But why Mr. Stark's body has undergone this evolution? We cannot diagnose it with our current medical methods. As for whether there are any adverse effects, it may take some time to observe before we can give an answer. As for the serious wounds on Mr. Stark's body, if I'm not mistaken, they should be left by some kind of creature fighting. Some kind of creature, this. Hearing this, a tear fell from the corner of Pepper's eye. As the attending doctor was speaking sadly, she heard the nurse's urgent call from Tony's ward behind her. Mr. Stark, you are in such a bad condition that you cannot leave here. Mr. Stark, please go back to bed. Hearing this, Pepper wiped away the tears from her eyes and hurried to Tony's bed. Tony, what you need now is rest. Go back to bed and recuperate. Watching Tony pull out the needle from his hand, Pepper frowned and shouted at Tony. But Tony ignored Pepper's words, and after pulling out the needle, he walked to the door of the ward. Seeing this, Pepper no longer hesitated, and walked directly to the door, blocking her way, looking at Tony with red eyes, without saying a word. Seeing Pepper's expression, Tony also knew that if he didn't explain these things clearly, Pepper would not let him go. He could only walk in front of Pepper, look into her eyes and said. Pepper, I know what you want to ask. I know my current physical condition very well. I am fine now. Do you remember what I said to you before? I have it as my own mission. At this point, Tony continued in a firm tone, and now is the time for me to fulfill my mission. Enough, Tony. But this time, before Tony could finish, Pepper interrupted him. Tony, I don't want to see you get hurt again. At this point, little Pepper couldn't hold back her tears any longer. Why? Why don't you say it out? Why do you have to bear it alone? Tony, you have been fighting alone, don't you think this is unreasonable? Pepper. Tony saw this scene, but the words came to his lips but he couldn't say them. If I can, I would also like to help you. After saying that, Pepper covered her face with her hands and started crying. Looking at Pepper crying for him, Tony's whole expression was shaken. Perhaps he didn't expect that Pepper would actually notice something, or perhaps it was because the previous Garangi clan had put too much pressure on Tony. At this moment, Tony seemed to have let go of his restraints, and he hugged Pepper affectionately. He put the corner of his mouth in Pepper's ear and kept whispering, Pepper, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. After a long time, Tony and Pepper separated. Tony looked at Pepper, whose face was red, and couldn't help but smile and whispered, she really looks like a pepper. What? Maybe Tony just spoke too softly, and then Pepper replied. No, nothing, Pepper, if you really want to know all this, then come with me now. Tony shook his head and looked at the woman who wanted to help him. At this moment, Tony seemed to have made up his mind and said to Pepper. I'll tell you everything. But you are hurt now. Unfortunately, compared to this, Pepper was more concerned about Tony's injuries at this time. Hearing this, Tony's heart warmed up and he whispered to Pepper. It's okay, this injury won't affect me. After saying that, Tony took Pepper's hand and left the hospital. Late at night, in Tony Stark's villa, Tony and Pepper were sitting in the hall chatting about something. It seemed like they had been there for a while. Well, this is everything that happened in these days. Tony, who was leaning on the sofa at this time, closed his eyes and told Pepper everything with a relaxed look. Pepper was stunned. Obviously, Tony's words completely broke the worldview that Pepper had formed since she was a child. However, after a long period of recovery, Pepper could only accept this fact helplessly. But Pepper still said to Tony worriedly, Tony, even though you have that transformation device, you can't take any more risks. You were lucky this time and got spared by that monster, but you don't always get this kind of luck. No, Pepper, don't you understand? These monsters have treated the entire New York City as their playground. In just one day, more than 40 people have been killed. This is what I killed before I fought that monster. If I let them continue to kill like this, New York City will be destroyed. At this point, Tony opened his eyes, stood up, and walked towards the underground laboratory. Besides, who else in New York City can stop them except me? I am just doing what I can. Pepper, you go back first, I will take care of this. Pepper, who saw this scene, stood up and moved her mouth slightly, but she didn't say anything. Because at this moment, Pepper had understood Tony's determination, which was a mentality of moving forward bravely with the determination to die. However, Pepper did not leave, but accompanied Tony to the laboratory. Pepper, what are you doing? Tony asked with a puzzled tone, looking at Pepper who had not left. Do you remember what I said in the hospital before? You are not fighting alone now. Pepper next to him answered Tony with a smile. Hearing this, Tony's eyes instantly turned red, and he was obviously moved by Pepper's words. However, Tony took a deep breath and controlled his emotions, because he knew that now was not the time to talk about love. If he wanted to talk about love, he had to destroy the Garangi clan that threatened New York City first. Thinking of this, Tony walked to the laboratory and said to Jarvis. Jarvis, give me the location map of today's victims and today's wind direction map. Yes, sir. After hearing Tony's voice, Jarvis quickly replied and listed the relevant information one by one. Seeing Tony checking the information, Pepper, who was watching on the side, asked curiously. Tony, aren't you researching weapons to fight monsters? Why are you looking at this information? Tony, who was looking at the information at this time, seemed to have discovered some secrets, and smiled happily, and said to Pepper. Know yourself and know your enemy, and you will win every battle. Only after you understand the habits of these monsters can you formulate the best way to deal with them. Pepper, take a look at these materials. Remember what I said before. The Garangi tribe is doing some kind of ritual in New York City. It's called a killing game. I was thinking, since it is a game, it must have its own unique set of rules. Just like the locust monster this time, why did he let me go in the end? It was because when he was about to kill me, his rules of the game changed. Changes. After hearing Tony's words, Pepper showed a confused expression. Yes, look at the location of the victims today and the change in wind direction, with the chimney in the dilapidated floor as the key point. If I'm not mistaken, the killing pattern of the locust monster must be related to the direction of the smoke coming out of the chimney. Once the direction of the smoke changes, the locust monster must stop killing and rush to the new direction of the smoke before continuing to kill. This is why the locust monster let me go at the last critical moment, because at that moment, a strong wind blew and changed the direction of the smoke. After hearing this, Xiao Lijiao also realized something and said in surprise. In this case, we can predict the next appearance point of the locust monster and ambush there in advance. That's right, the reason why I lost to him before was because I didn't know his details, and he used his bouncing method to play a trick on me. Speaking of this, Tony gritted his teeth and said, obviously he was upset about today's defeat. But if I know the truth this time, I will have to treat him well. After saying that, Tony showed a sinister smile. Pepper beside him asked curiously. It's already past 2 a.m., and there are only a few hours until the next locust monster attacks in the morning. Can you really think of a way to deal with it? Tony said with confidence. There is enough time. This time I will prepare a special weapon for him. Early in the morning, in Tony Stark's laboratory. Pepper had already fallen asleep on the sofa. At this time, Tony, who was on the test bench, stood up excitedly and shouted. Okay, it's finally done. The originally sleeping Pepper was also awakened by Tony's excited shout. She quickly raised her head and looked at Tony, saying, Tony, is everything done? Well, it's all done. Tony realized that he had accidentally woken up Pepper, and after replying with embarrassment, he walked up to Pepper. Pepper, you just need to go back to the company, and leave the rest to me. Hearing this, Pepper, who was still a little sleepy, woke up instantly and looked at Tony with a worried look on her face. No, Tony, I don't feel comfortable with you going alone. Tony felt warm inside when he saw the worried Pepper in front of him, but he still insisted on his decision and continued. Just go back to the company. The next battle is not something you should touch. Don't worry, Pepper. I am the famous Tony Stark. How can I fail? After saying that, Tony gave Pepper a thumbs up and looked at her with a bright smile. After a moment, Tony stood up, walked to the center of the laboratory, and said to Jarvis. Jarvis, load the iron suit. Okay, sir. As Jarvis finished speaking, the machines in the laboratory started to move, loading the Iron Man suit for Tony. Pepper on the side could only watch all this with a worried look on her face. Pepper, I'm leaving. Wait for me in the company. After successfully loading the Iron Man suit, Tony glanced at Pepper next to him and resolutely left the laboratory. Pepper stood there for a long time after Tony left before leaving the laboratory room. But when Xiao Lijiao left, she kept saying in her heart, God bless Tony. At a pier on the edge of New York City, Tony Stark was hiding in a hidden corner, waiting for the locust monster to arrive. After waiting for a while, Tony Stark heard the reminder of the contracted beast. Sure enough, I guessed right. Judging from today's wind direction and the location of the chimney, the monster's activity location is in this area. Hearing the call of the contracted beast in his ear, Tony smiled slightly and thought to himself. Let's fight it out this time. As soon as he finished speaking, Tony walked out of the Iron Man suit and walked in front of the mirror that he had prepared earlier. Transform. With Tony's order, Tony once again turned into Kamen Rider Iron Man. After the transformation was successful, Tony pulled out the summoning machine gun on his waist, turned his head and said to the Iron Man suit, Come on, Jarvis. Yes, sir. After hearing what Tony said, Jarvis immediately controlled the Iron Man suit and loaded it on Tony. Once again, Tony transformed into a 3-in-1 mecha with red, green and white as the main colors, but it was different from the previous one against Obadiah. At this time, Tony's new form was heavier than before. Obviously, this was a new design that Tony deliberately made to deal with the locust monster. Tony looked at his new form and nodded with satisfaction. The Iron Man suit can only exist in the mirror world for 3 or 4 hours, so we need to make a quick decision. Thinking of this, Tony no longer hesitated and went directly into the mirror world. Mirror world. The previous wounds on the locust monster had long been healed. At this time, the locust monster was observing the human world through mirrors in the mirror world, obviously wanting to choose its prey this time. But this time, before the locust monster decided on its next prey, Tony arrived at the scene. At this time, Tony was flying in the sky with the help of his iron suit. Seeing the locust monster in front of him staring at the mirror, Tony knew that the locust monster was choosing a suitable target. Without any hesitation, he directly raised the summoning machine gun in his hand and shot at the locust monster. Collapse! 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 Countless lasers shot at the locust monster, but the locust monster still remained vigilant. In addition, it was previously injured by the summoned machine gun. So after hearing the unique shooting sound of the summoned machine gun, it actually jumped into the sky at the first time and successfully avoided Tony's attack. Seeing this, Tony was not in a hurry to chase it, but fell from the sky, looking at the locust monster standing on the top floor and shouted. Hey, you monster should be able to understand human language, right? I want to ask, what is the purpose of your so-called killing game of the Garangi clan? Obviously, in this battle with the locust monster, Tony not only wanted to defeat the opponent, but also wanted to understand the enemy's purpose. It was just a pity for Tony that the locust monster laughed loudly after hearing what Tony said. Ha 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 ha, as an inferior race, the only fate is to be dominated. After saying that, the locust monster did not explain any more and jumped directly towards Tony. An inferior race. Then I'll show you what an inferior race fights back. After hearing what the locust monster said, Tony's heart was filled with anger, and he picked up the summoning machine gun again to attack the locust monster. However, this time was no different from the previous time. Facing the amazing jumping power of the locust monster, Tony's attack could not hit the enemy at all. Ha ha ha, it's useless, Kamen Rider Teppei, none of your attacks can hit me. Seeing Tony's attacks fail one by one, the locust monster laughed and laughed. But what the locust monster didn't know was that all of this was Tony's plan. Looking at the locust monster getting closer and closer to him, Tony knew that the opportunity had come, and he didn't hesitate any longer, and shouted directly. Jarvis, start Plan 1. As Tony's order was issued, the steel armor on Tony fired 4 small devices directly in the direction of the locust monster. When the locust monster saw Tony launching a new attack towards itself, its first reaction was to dodge in time. But Tony also realized this. Although it was difficult for his summoned machine gun to hit the locust monster, it could control the jumping position of the locust monster by shooting at some special positions. In addition, the locust monster discovered that the small device it had just fired was not aimed at itself, but fell around itself, so it did not dodge anymore. Tony saw this scene, a smile appeared on his face, and he said to the locust monster. Humph, let's let you, a beast, see what is the fruit of human wisdom, and what is an inferior race. Let's see who is the real inferior race. After saying that, Tony did not delay any longer, and directly activated the small device that fell around the locust monster. At this time, the locust monster in the middle position also reacted, knowing that something bad was going to happen, and hurriedly wanted to jump away from the spot again. But unfortunately, everything was too late. As Tony activated the small device, the small device that fell around the locust monster suddenly emitted lightning, and shot at the locust monster at an extremely fast speed. Ah! The powerful lightning instantly hit the locust monster, causing it to scream in pain. But the locust monster is a member of the fighting race Garangi after all, and its super high fighting quality played a role at this moment. The locust monster knew that if it continued like this, it would definitely face a heavy blow from Tony, so it reacted the moment it was electrocuted. It actually directly withstood the attack of lightning and rushed directly to one of the devices. In just 3 or 5 strokes, one of the devices was destroyed. Then the locust monster used the same method to destroy the remaining 3 small devices. Tony, who was standing aside, saw the locust monster destroying the small device, but did not stop it. Because this small device can only generate electricity for a limited time and cannot last for long. In addition, the main purpose of Tony creating this device was not to rely on this little electricity to destroy the monster. Instead, he wanted to use the effect of electricity to paralyze the locust monster's body and weaken the locust monster's jumping power. At this time, after destroying all the devices, the locust monster roared at Tony breathlessly. Kamen Rider Teppei, use whatever tricks you have. If that's the case, then let me show you my boxing skills that I didn't show in the previous fight with you. Hearing this, Tony showed a smug smile, put the summoning machine gun in his hand back to his waist, put his hands in a boxing stance, and said to the locust monster. Your biggest mistake was letting me go last time, because I will never lose to the same person twice. After saying that, Tony controlled the Iron Man's booster to accelerate and rushed directly towards the locust monster. Seeing Tony getting closer and closer to him, the locust monster originally wanted to jump away immediately. First, keep a distance, and then slowly look for an opportunity to deal with Tony. But the limbs that had been electrocuted before were now in a state of paralysis, causing the locust monster to not store enough strength to jump in the first place. And in this short period of time, Tony has successfully shortened the distance between the two. Looking at the locust monster in front of him, Tony, like the last time, directly sent 3 consecutive left-hand jabs to the locust monster. Boom, boom, boom. Tony's 3 consecutive jabs all hit the locust monster's head. However, unlike the previous time when the locust monster easily took them, Tony's punching power was more than twice as strong as before, thanks to the iron suit. Under Tony's jab attack, the locust monster fell into a semi-comatose state. Seeing this opportunity, Tony half-crouched, put his right fist on his abdomen, and swung it from bottom to top, hitting the locust monster's abdomen directly. Ah! The severe pain from the abdomen woke the locust monster up and it screamed miserably. The locust monster was also hit by Tony and flew into the sky. Finally, it fell to the 3rd floor of the next floor. Tony saw this and did not intend to give the locust monster a chance to recover. He directly controlled the iron suit to fly up and landed on the 3rd floor. The locust monster, who was knocked unconscious by Tony, also struggled to stand up at this time. Seeing that Tony also flew to his side, the locust monster wanted to distance himself first and wait for himself to recover before making plans. But how could Tony give him this opportunity? He rushed towards the locust monster again and used a combination of punches on the locust monster. Facing Tony's fierce attack, the locust monster could only put up his hands for defense. But the locust monster was not the type of monster with strong defense after all. After enduring several heavy punches and side kicks from Tony, he only felt pain all over his body, and after this period of time. After being hit, the limbs that were originally shocked by the electric shock also began to recover slowly. Therefore, the locust monster became ruthless and thought that a short pain is better than a long one. In the face of another heavy blow from Tony, it actually let go of its defensive posture. It directly bore Tony's attack this time, and when it was attacked, it relaxed the control of its body. It successfully used the force of this attack to distance itself from Tony. When Tony saw that the locust monster had distanced itself, he knew that the previous paralysis effect was about to disappear. Without hesitation, he gave up the idea of close combat, pulled out the summoning machine gun from his waist and started shooting. But how could the locust monster, whose body had recovered this time, be hit by this move? The locust monster jumped directly, and jumped from the 3rd floor to the top floor again, and Tony's lasers were all avoided by the locust monster. Seeing this situation, the locust monster laughed. Ha 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 ha, Kamen Rider Teppei, I'm going to give you back what you said before. Your biggest mistake was not seizing the opportunity to defeat me. Now you won't have another chance. Tony smiled after hearing what the locust monster said. Really? After saying that, Tony flew up and flew towards the locust monster. During this time, he did not stop attacking, but continued to shoot at the locust monster. Seeing this, the locust monster did not hesitate, and jumped back and forth between different floors nearby to avoid Tony's attack. While dodging the attack, the locust monster did not fight back even when it had the opportunity to fight back. Obviously, the locust monster knew that the Kamen Rider could only move around in the mirror world for a limited time. He wanted to delay Tony's strongest period, and then teach him a lesson when Tony turned back into a human. In this way, the two sides were suddenly in a stalemate. After chasing for a while, Tony also understood the locust monster's idea, so he stopped delaying and said to Jarvis. Jarvis, start plan 2 inches. Okay, sir. As Tony gave the order, the iron suit on Tony changed shape again. Bullet holes appeared on the back of Tony's iron suit, and then small missiles shot out from the iron suit and flew towards the locust monster. It turned out that the reason why Tony's 3-in-1 mecha looked heavier than when he dealt with Obadiah was because Tony loaded a lot of special weapons specifically designed to deal with locust monsters in this iron suit. Looking at the missiles flying towards him again, the locust monster learned its lesson this time. It jumped directly in the opposite direction, not giving these missiles a chance to surround itself. Humph, it's useless. These are the special fully automatic tracking cold liquid missiles I prepared specifically for you. You can't avoid them all. Seeing the locust monster trying to avoid the missiles by jumping, Tony showed a smug expression on his face. This is the crystallization of human wisdom, technology. Just as Tony finished speaking, the missile that was originally avoided by the locust monster suddenly turned around and continued to fly towards the locust monster. This shocked the locust monster, who had never expected that there would be such a weapon in the world. When he wanted to dodge again, it was too late. Countless cold liquid missiles hit the locust monster directly. Bang! 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 Seeing that all the cold liquid missiles hit the locust monster, Tony smiled. Then he landed back on the ground and walked towards the locust monster step by step. At this time, pieces of frost formed on the body of the locust monster. It turned out that Tony knew that even if such a small missile could hit the locust monster, it could only cause a little damage to it at most. But if it was replaced with a cold liquid missile, it could effectively limit the locust monster's ability to move. The locust monster's own combat power and physical fitness did not have much advantage over Tony. The reason why it was able to beat Tony last time was all due to its unique mobility. Therefore, when Tony stayed up all night last night, the direction of his research was how to limit the mobility of the locust monster. Judging from the current battle results, there is no doubt that Tony's research direction was not wrong. Looking at the slow movements of the locust monster, Tony did not show mercy. He walked directly to the front of the locust monster, grabbed the locust monster's neck with his hand, aimed the summoning machine gun at the locust monster's head, and said, "Tell me everything about the so-called ritual and killing game of your Garangi clan, and how to stop the ritual." The locust monster, who was still struggling, gave up struggling after hearing this, and laughed wildly at Tony. Ha! Ha ha, it's too late. It's all too late. Once the ceremony begins, it can't be stopped. Until the whole ceremony is completed, we will play the final game with the king of our tribe, and finally we will encounter the true ultimate darkness, and the whole world will be destroyed by our Garangi tribe. At this point, the locust monster ignored Tony and kept laughing wildly. After Tony heard what the locust monster said, his face suddenly darkened, and he continued to speak to the locust monster hurriedly. What is the final game, and what is the real ultimate darkness? But no matter what Tony said, the locust monster ignored Tony and just laughed. Seeing this, Tony knew that he would not get any more information, and he was about to reach the limit of his activities in the mirror world. He did not hesitate and threw the locust monster into the sky. Then Tony pulled out a card from his waist and inserted it into the summoning machine gun. Shooting, huge launcher. As the electronic sound fell, Tony held the giant launcher exclusively armed by Kamen Rider Teppany and pressed the launch button directly at the locust monster in the sky. Bang! With a shocking explosion, the locust monster turned into nothingness. After the death of the locust monster, the energy crystal was also devoured by Tony's contracted beast, the giant bull. Through this battle, Tony successfully reached level 10. But Tony was not happy at this time, because the words of the locust monster before were like a thorn in Tony's heart. Will the end of the ritual lead to the true ultimate darkness? In the real world, in Stark Industries, Pepper is sitting alone in her office. Unlike her usual diligent attitude, Pepper is now worried. Apparently, she is worried about Tony's safety and cannot work at ease. But at this moment, a familiar voice comes from behind Pepper. Oh, what's wrong with you, Pepper? Are you worried about your work today, or are you worried about your boss's safety? It turned out that Tony came to Pepper's office through the mirror world after defeating the locust monster. Finally, he walked out of the full-length mirror behind Pepper. Hearing Tony's voice behind him, Pepper turned around in surprise and looked at Tony. Finally, he covered his smile with his hands and smiled. No, I'm just thinking about whether I should go to see the scenery of New York City tonight. Hearing this, Tony's face lit up, and then he walked in front of Pepper and looked into her eyes. After a long time, Tony stretched out his right hand, placed it in front of Pepper, and said slowly, I wonder if the beautiful Miss Pepper would give me the honor to accompany you to enjoy the beautiful scenery of New York City tonight. After hearing this, Pepper shyly stretched out her right hand and shook hands with Tony. Well, that depends on what someone does next. After that, Tony and Pepper left Stark Industries. A few months later, late at night. At this time, in the Shield, Agent Coulson was standing in front of the office desk and reporting to a person the intelligence he had collected in the past few days. After Agent Coulson finished reporting all the intelligence, the person turned around and looked at Agent Coulson. This person was Nick Fury, who had appeared in Tony's villa earlier. Nick Fury put the information in his hand back on the table, looked up and said to Agent Coulson. In other words, you saw Tony going to a certain place alone these days and coming back injured. Yes, and for some reason, the death toll in the entire city has increased significantly recently. We have reason to suspect that Tony is fighting some unknown creature. Those innocent people might have been killed by the creatures that were fighting Tony. Hearing Nick Fury's question, Agent Coulson nodded, but soon said with difficulty. But unfortunately Tony was too cautious, and every time he went out he would find a special way to get rid of us. Even if we go to the hospital, we can't get Tony's medical report. It seems that Tony has deliberately hidden it. Hearing this, Nick Fury subconsciously touched his chin and then said to Agent Coulson. Don't worry, we will send the most powerful agents to carry out this mission. After saying that, Nick Fury pressed a button on the side. Then, the door of Nick Fury's office opened. A red-haired girl with gorgeous clothes and attractive figure walked in. After seeing the person who walked in, Agent Coulson also smiled and said, It seems that ordinary agents like us will not have a chance to take action next. It turned out that the red-haired girl was one of Nick Fury's most capable subordinates and the most deadly agent in the world, the Black Widow Natasha Romanoff. After Natasha Romanoff came in again, she nodded to Agent Coulson and said hello, then looked at Nick Fury and said, Who is the mission this time? Hearing this, Nick Fury threw the documents on the table to Natasha. Natasha nimbly caught the documents thrown by Nick Fury and started reading them page by page. After a moment, Natasha licked her tempting lips and said happily, Is it him, the famous Iron Man? It seems like there will be fun again this time. After saying that, Natasha ignored Nick Fury and Coulson in the office, waved her hand, and left the office. In response, Nick Fury and Coulson could only shake their heads helplessly, obviously they were used to it. Black Widow is out, come down and let me see your secret, Tony. Thinking of this, Nick Fury also signaled Coulson to leave, and sat alone in his office chair, looking at the beautiful scenery in the sky. Mirror World. In a dimly lit bar, a group of weird people wearing strange clothes gathered together and discussed what happened today. I heard that the whale guy died. What a useless waste, he actually died at the hands of Kamen Rider. It is simply an insult to the honor of our clan. Yeah, it's really trash. But if that's the case, then a total of 8 members of our Garangi clan have died at the hands of Kamen Rider, which is really abominable. Just as this group of monsters were getting more and more angry, Rose walked in. Seeing that it was Rose who came in, the originally noisy bar instantly became quiet. All the monsters stood quietly, waiting for Rose to speak. After looking around, Rose slowly said, You have been disqualified from the next competition, leave now. After hearing this, the weirdos at the scene instantly exploded and questioned Rose Girl. Why did you disqualify us from the competition? But before Rose could answer, another group of weirdos came in from the depths of the bar. They said to the disqualified weirdos, Why Of course you are too weak, ha 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 ha, the ceremony has been going on for almost 4 months, but there is no progress, you are really a bunch of rubbish. After saying that, the group of new weirdos laughed at each other. What did you say? Do you want to die? Hearing the laughter of the weirdos in the bar could no longer bear it and turned back into fighting form. What, do you want to fight? I'm afraid you will all die here. Seeing the weirdos in the bar change into fighting form, the new weirdos were not to be outdone and also changed back into fighting form. But just as the two sides were about to fight, Rose took out a piece of parchment and stopped the fight. And he said to the weirdos in the bar, "This is the rule, and the rule cannot be violated." Hearing this, the weirdos who were originally in the bar could only retreat back to human form dejectedly and slowly left the bar. Seeing that the weirdos who were originally in the bar had left the bar, the group of new weirdos quickly took up their seats and sat down. Only one male weirdo in a black and gold vest was left standing there, looking at Rose. Rose waited until the scene became quiet again, put away the parchment in her hand, and raised her right hand again. She inserted the deformed ring on her hand into the waist of the male weirdo in a black and gold vest in front of her. 2 days, 90 people. After the Rose girl finished speaking, she pulled out the deformed ring and left the bar alone. The male weirdo in the black and gold vest in front of him laughed wildly. Ha 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 ha, it's finally my turn. A few weeks later. In the real world. Stark Industries. Tony was doing boxing training with Happy. As the two were training with a smile on their faces and telling jokes. Pepper Potts came in and said to Tony, who was training in the ring, "Tony, the justice is here, you can sign the transfer documents." Tony, who is still training with Happy, replied, "I'm still fighting with Happy." After saying that, he continued to fight with Happy, and after dodging one of Happy's attacks, he used his elbow to hit Happy's face. "Oh!" Happy cried out after being hit, stepped back a few steps, and said to Tony, "What's that for?" Tony just made a light-hearted joke. "Sorry, this is called mixed martial arts, and it's only been around for about 3 weeks." Hearing this, Happy stared at Tony with his eyes wide open. "This is called dirty boxing, and it has a long history." "Okay, my bad, raise it up and continue." Just as Tony and Happy were talking, a charming and beautiful red-haired girl walked in. Happy, who was practicing boxing with Tony, was stunned and stared at the red-haired woman in front of him. Tony was also confused by Happy's perverted look and turned his head to look in the direction of Happy's gaze. In just a moment, Tony was also attracted by the red-haired woman in front of him. However, Happy behind him had already come to his senses and touched Tony's head as if to sneak attack. When Tony turned his head, Happy waved his boxing gloves at Tony and said proudly, "Lesson 1. Never take your eyes off." But before Happy could finish, Tony made a flying kick and kicked Happy away. Then Tony quickly ran towards Happy and launched a series of attacks on Happy. Of course, all of this was done under Tony's conscious control of his strength. At this time, Tony's body had been greatly improved with the help of the contracted beast Behemoth Bull. Maybe Tony's body is not as good as Captain America's now, but it is believed that it is 40% to 50% of the level. And with the help of the contracted beast Behemoth Bull, Tony successfully suppressed the damage of the nuclear radiation in his body to his body. As long as Tony keeps upgrading and strengthening like this, nuclear radiation will not harm Tony sooner or later. After a series of attacks, Tony stopped attacking and clapped his hands with Happy. "Okay, I'm done." He picked up the nutrient solution beside him and drank it, pointing at the red-haired woman who had just arrived. "What's your name, miss?" the red-haired woman said to Tony after hearing his question. "Natasha Romanov." Hearing this, Tony said to Natasha while drinking the nutrient solution, "Come here, come to the ring." At this time, after hearing this, the little pepper beside Natasha not only objected. "No, you don't really call her." But before Pepper could finish, Natasha interrupted her and said with a smile, "It's okay, let me try." Hearing this, Pepper could only say to Natasha with an apology, "Sorry, Tony can be weird sometimes." Natasha just waved her hand to show that she didn't mind and walked towards Tony Stark. She showed her charming smile in front of Tony. But at this time, Tony drank the nutrient solution and looked at Natasha for a moment and said, "What? After hearing Tony's question, Natasha's smile disappeared. But before Natasha could say anything, Tony stopped Happy and said to him, Happy, can you teach her a lesson? Upon hearing this, Happy's eyes lit up instantly. He quickly put on his boxing gloves and said to Tony excitedly, No problem. After doing all this, Tony left the ring, walked to Pepper's side and sat down, and asked Pepper, Who is she? Obviously, after these days of fighting with the mirror world, Tony's vigilance has been greatly improved. Although the red-haired woman in front of him is just an ordinary human, Tony's vigilance is telling him that this red-haired woman is not simple. After hearing this, Pepper, who was sitting next to him, said directly to Tony, She is from the legal department. If you keep flirting with her, I can take you to court at any time. After hearing what Pepper said, Tony joked to her, I need a new assistant, boss. Obviously, Pepper understood the meaning of Tony's words, and turned to look at Tony and said word by word. Yes, I have 3 great candidates, and they are all ready to meet you. Feeling the murderous tone in Pepper's voice, Tony swallowed his saliva and dared not continue. At this time, Tony Stark had the image of a henpecked man. Obviously, since Tony and Pepper had a heart-to-heart talk last time, their relationship has made great progress. In addition, Tony at this time was not threatened by nuclear radiation like in the original book. Therefore, Tony at this moment still maintained a rational attitude and did not choose to give up on himself. Pepper, who was standing aside, saw Tony's image of being punched, and couldn't help laughing and covered the corners of her mouth. But then Pepper showed a worried look on her face and said to Tony, Tony, are you really going to give me the executive power of the company? Let me be the CEO. This time, Tony interrupted Pepper before she finished speaking, and said to her, I'm a henpecked man. No, don't say that, Pepper, you know my current situation. I have to face challenges every day. Before Tony could finish, Pepper put her finger on Tony's mouth and said to him seriously, Tony, don't say such unlucky words anymore. Looking at Pepper's serious expression, Tony could only wave his hand helplessly and continued. Well, it's just an assumption. My main purpose in doing this is to make Stark Industries use it in the right way. After all, who knows if there are still scum like Obadiah in the company. Of course, the most important thing is that I believe in you. At this point, Tony held Pepper's hand and looked at her affectionately. Pepper, who was sitting next to Tony, was also moved by Tony's words and could not help but slowly approach Tony. Just as Tony and Pepper were getting closer and closer, a loud noise suddenly came from the ring. Tony and Pepper's world was directly interrupted. The two of them were like being electrocuted, and they hurriedly let go of each other and looked at the ring. It turned out that Happy was thrown out by Natasha's head. Seeing this, Pepper hurriedly stood up and said nervously, Are you okay, Happy? After hearing this, Happy waved his hand nonchalantly and said, It's okay, how could it be okay, I just slipped. Tony also stood up at this time, walked to the edge of the ring, rang the bell, and joked to Happy. Really? I think he was knocked down. Hearing this, Happy could only smile helplessly and walked aside. At this time, Natasha also came down and said to Tony, Mr. Stark, I need your fingerprints. After saying that, he took out the notarized document signed by Pepper Potts and fingerprinted Tony. Tony wanted to tease her when he saw this, but when he saw Pepper Potts coming over, he could only put on a serious expression and stamp his fingerprints on the notarized document. Noticing that Tony's eyes were not looking around, Pepper Potts nodded with satisfaction and walked over to ask, Tony, what's going on? Tony said seriously. Well, very good, it's all done, now you are the boss. After saying that, he smiled at Pepper. When Pepper was about to reply after hearing this, the mechanical bracelet on Tony's hand suddenly flashed red. Seeing this, Pepper's heart tightened, because she knew that this bracelet was specially used by Tony to warn of the appearance of monsters in the mirror world. Instinctively, she wanted to say something to Tony. But Tony stopped her immediately and signaled to Pepper with his eyes. Then he said to Natasha, Oh, I remember I have something else to do. I'll let the new CEO talk to you. Then, Tony left the lounge, leaving Pepper worriedly watching Tony leave. Natasha looked back and forth between Pepper and Tony with a slightly interested look. It seems that Pepper also knows the secret. I am really curious about the secret you are hiding, Tony. Thinking of this, Natasha showed a charming smile on her face, which stunned Happy beside her. After leaving the lounge, Tony hurried to a secret base that he had secretly built in Stark Industries. When Tony entered the secret base, he said to Jarvis. Jarvis, did you receive any intelligence? After hearing Tony's question, Jarvis's unique voice rang out in the base. Sir, since 8 o'clock this morning, innocent people in New York City have been attacked and killed by unknown people. According to the intelligence collected at the scene, the victims were killed by some object piercing their heads. This is the picture collected at the scene. According to the preliminary judgment, the enemy may be a monster with B abilities. After hearing what Jarvis said, Tony sat down and looked through the information Jarvis collected this morning one by one. It turned out that since the battle with the Locust monster, Tony realized the importance of collecting intelligence. As long as you know the enemy's approximate abilities and activity patterns in advance, you can find a way to resolve them one by one. In addition, the Garangi clan's activity venue is the entire New York City, and it is really difficult for Tony to take care of everything when he is alone. Therefore, during this period of time, Tony opened up most of the information networks in New York City, and with the assistance of Jarvis. As long as there is an incomprehensible murder case that passes Jarvis's review, it will be passed to Tony's ears. And Tony will also judge the enemy's activity patterns and approximate abilities this time based on this information. This is also the reason why Tony was able to effectively and quickly defeat other Garangi after the battle with the Locust monster. Tony sat at his desk, flipping through the information with a grim look on his face. It seems that the monster that appeared this time is a B-shaped monster. Obviously, Tony found the problem after reading all the information. He directly marked the place where he was killed this morning and said to himself. Each time the masses were killed, there was an interval of 15 minutes, and the situation continued to expand in a spiral shape. Isn't this kind of movement trajectory the unique movement trajectory of scout bees among bees? At this point, Tony pointed his finger at a place and pressed it hard. If I'm not mistaken, the next location of its activity will be here. After saying that, Tony no longer hesitated, stood up and said to Jarvis. Jarvis, quickly load the Iron Man suit. Obviously, Tony wanted to get rid of this bee-related monster before the next time innocent people were killed. At this time, the Iron Man suit was ready in the center of the secret base. Waiting for Tony's arrival, it was obvious that Jarvis had anticipated Tony's next move. It can also be seen from here that Jarvis is becoming more and more intelligent. After Tony loaded the Iron Man suit, he flew directly into the sky. When the residents near the Stark Industrial Building saw Iron Man flying, they exclaimed and took out their mobile phones to take pictures. Real world. His eyes once again turned back to the wasp monster at this moment. The wasp monster was flying in the sky of the real world at this moment, choosing its next prey. At this moment, a voice came from a rooftop below the wasp monster. Hey, how's the game going? Hearing this, the wasp monster turned his head. It turned out that the one who was calling the wasp monster on the top floor was one of his partners, the bat monster. The bat monster in front of him was wearing a black hat and all black clothes. He was talking to the wasp monster in human form. Seeing that it was his partner, the wasp monster flew down directly. At the same time, he shook a strange ring on his hand and showed off to his partner, the bat monster. Haha, these lindos are really fragile. I have only used them for a few hours and have already completed a quarter of my goal. Looking at the wasp monster showing off his achievements today, the bat monster was about to speak. Suddenly, a laser shot towards the two monsters from above. Collapse. The laser shot at the bracelet that the wasp monster had just shown off to the bat monster. It turned out that Tony had already arrived at the scene and was watching the two monsters below chatting. Tony couldn't help but feel lucky that he came a step early and no new victims appeared. Thinking of this, Tony did not hesitate and directly aimed his palm at the bee monster below. He directly fired a laser attack at the wasp monster. No. Seeing his counting bracelet being knocked off by Tony's laser, he fell from the top floor. The wasp monster didn't care about anything else, and flew up directly, flying towards the direction of the counting bracelet. When the bat monster saw Tony coming, he also left the scene tactfully. After all, it was not his time to compete yet, so he couldn't act casually. Seeing the bat monster leave, Tony didn't do anything either. After all, there were two monsters at the same time this time. Even Tony was not sure of winning, so of course he had to eliminate the wasp monster, the target this time, first. Thinking of this, Tony landed directly on the top floor and walked out of the iron suit. He transformed into a reflector on the top floor. Transform. As the flash of light ended, Kamen Rider Teppei appeared again, and after Tony finished transforming, he jumped down from the top floor and shouted, "Jarvis." After hearing Tony's order, the iron armor that Tony had just taken off suddenly disintegrated by itself. It turned into pieces of parts and flew to Tony, who was jumping down from the roof at this time. A moment later, the 3-in-1 mecha form appeared again. At this time, the wasp monster had just flown down and was about to pick up his counting bracelet. Tony was already by his side. Tony looked at the wasp monster in front of him and did not delay any time. He rushed directly to the wasp monster. He held the wasp monster in his arms and rushed into a mirror on the side together. The wasp monster, who was about to pick up the counting bracelet, was taken into the mirror world by Tony, leaving only the counting bracelet empty on the ground. Fortunately, the place chosen by the wasp monster this time was relatively closed, there were no people there, and no one noticed the battle process this time. Mirror world. At this time, Tony hugged the wasp monster and fell hard to the ground. The wasp monster, who already had weak melee ability, cried out in pain. However, the wasp monster is worthy of being a member of the Garangi clan. After enduring the attack, he endured the severe pain and secretly placed his upper right hand on the chest of Tony, who was hugging him. This whole process did not arouse Tony's suspicion at all. After Tony saw the monster fell to the ground, he directly rode on the wasp monster and punched the wasp monster hard. Tony thought that the wasp monster's hands on Tony's chest were just a weak struggle made by the wasp monster to break free from his restraints. Seeing this, the wasp monster knew that his chance had come, and laughed directly at Tony. Haha, go to hell, Kamen Rider. After saying that, the wasp monster directly launched its strongest attack. A giant needle suddenly shot out from the right arm of the wasp monster. It directly pierced into Tony's body. Even with the double protection of the Iron Man suit and the Kamen Rider armor, it still couldn't protect Tony's body. The giant needle pierced through Tony's body from front to back. Fortunately, Tony had just maintained a suppressive attack on the wasp monster, which caused the wasp monster to not aim the needle at the heart. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable. But even so, Tony, who was pierced through the body by the wasp monster, couldn't help but scream. Ah! Severe pain instantly spread all over Tony's body, and Tony, who was originally suppressing the attack, instantly became a weak shrimp. His whole body began to twitch, and he could no longer attack the wasp monster. Seeing this, the wasp monster laughed triumphantly. Ha 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 ha, Kamen Rider Teppei, it looks like today is the day you die. After saying that, the wasp monster punched Tony, who was riding on him hard, and directly knocked Tony out. Ah! 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 After being knocked out, Tony rolled on the ground for several times before finally stopping. But the severe pain all over his body still troubled Tony, making him scream continuously, and he couldn't use any strength in his body. He just felt that he might as well die now. But the training of these days finally worked. Looking at the wasp monster in front of him, laughing triumphantly, he slowly walked towards him step by step. I was careless. I knew he was a bee-shaped monster, but he still killed innocent people by piercing their heads. But I didn't think of paying attention to these details in the battle. It seems that I have been too smooth in dealing with monsters during this period, so I let my guard down. Thinking of this, Tony couldn't help but regret it. But Tony knew that now was not the time to think about these things. If he continued like this, he would definitely die here. This made Tony recall every bit of his life with Pepper during this period in his mind. Then he thought of his own mission. All of this became Tony's motivation to take action again. Yes, I promised Pepper that I would not die here. I don't want to be a person who doesn't keep his word. I am a brave man. Thinking of this, Tony felt a new strength surge in his body. He made up his mind and stretched out his right hand to hold the giant needle that pierced his body. Ah! Tony roared, and the giant needle was pulled out of his chest. Tony threw away the giant needle stained with his own blood, staggered to his feet again, and once again set up an attack posture towards the bee monster. At this time, the wasp monster also saw Tony's action, and continued to say to Tony in a rampant tone. Ha 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 ha, give up struggling, Kamen Rider Tetsuho, now only death is waiting for you. After saying that, the wasp monster accelerated and rushed towards Tony. And when it got in front of Tony, it swung its claws at Tony. Although Tony pulled out the giant needle at this time, the injury still existed. The wound on his chest troubled Tony all the time, making Tony weak and painful all over, and unable to make an effective counterattack. He could only passively withstand the attacks of the wasp monster again and again, but Tony's will was also very firm. Every time he was knocked to the ground by the wasp monster, he stood up again and again. He was knocked to the ground again and again. It kept repeating like this, and he never gave up struggling. The wasp monster watched Tony being knocked down again and again, and stood up again and again. He couldn't help feeling extremely angry, and kept roaring at Tony. Fall, 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 why don't you fall yet? Having said that, the wasp monster knocked Tony down again, and raised his right hand and looked at it. It was a pity that after the giant stinger just fired, the new giant stinger had not grown out completely, otherwise Tony would not be alive until now. Thinking of this, the wasp monster couldn't help but continue to rage, and for the first time complained about why his close combat ability was so weak. At this time, Tony stood up again and saw that the wasp monster did not attack him at the first time, but looked at his right hand. Tony knew that this was an opportunity, and hurriedly issued an order to Jarvis in his now weak voice. Jaw. Weiss. Automatic. Destruction mode. Okay, sir. Tony's weak voice sounded, and the worn iron suit on Tony's body emitted a red flash. Then it disintegrated again, turning into pieces and flying towards the wasp monster. At this time, the wasp monster was still complaining, and didn't notice anything about Tony. By the time the wasp monster paid attention, the iron suit had already flown in front of him, and it turned into something like chains, trapping him in place. Seeing the mecha on Tony's body flying over, it turned into chains and trapped himself. The wasp monster couldn't help but screamed in fear. What is this coming from? But before the wasp monster could say more, red flashes appeared on the iron suit that had turned into a chain. Bang! A violent explosion sounded instantly. Tony looked at the flames in front of him and knew that this level of attack would never be able to defeat the wasp monster. Therefore, Tony endured the severe pain in his body, tremblingly pulled out a card from his waist, and inserted it into the summoning machine gun. Finally it comes. An electronic voice slowly sounded, and a silver-green robot with two horns on its head appeared in front of Tony. This was Tony's contracted beast, the giant bull. Go to hell. Seeing the contracted beast standing in front of him, Tony smiled. But then Tony inserted the summoning machine gun into the back of the contracted beast, the giant bull. Just as Tony was about to press the button, the wasp monster flew out of the fire in front of Tony and left the scene. Obviously, it suffered a lot of injuries under the self-detonation attack of the iron suit, and when it saw Tony use the strongest killing move, it finally came. Knowing that it had missed the best opportunity to defeat Tony, it simply flew up and left the scene. Seeing the wasp monster leave, Tony could no longer bear the severe pain in his body and fell directly to the ground. Call. I was lucky to escape. Tony was panting on the ground while summarizing his mistakes this time. Thinking of the previous times when he fought against the monsters of the Garangi clan, although there was no shortage of powerful monsters, he defeated them one by one in the end. But he didn't expect that he would be defeated by such a weak monster today. This made Tony sigh that no matter how weak the monster he encountered in the future, he must go all out and take every opponent seriously. In this way, after Tony rested on the ground for a while, he slowly stood up and summoned another treasure of his in the mirror world, and drove out the flying shot. As the door of the flying shot opened, Tony slowly sat on it and started the flying shot. In this way, Tony drove the flying shot away from the scene. It was late at night. At this time in Tony Stark's villa. Pepper was walking back and forth anxiously in the hall alone, obviously waiting for Tony to come back. After all, it had been more than 10 hours since Tony left in the morning to deal with the monster. If it were usual, Tony would have returned to the villa by now and stayed in the laboratory alone to conduct experiments on the Iron Man suit. But at this time today, Tony still hadn't come back. In addition, Pepper remembered what Tony said in the morning, and couldn't help but have a bad premonition. Ha! Thinking of this, Xiaolajao hurriedly slapped herself and said to herself. No, it's okay, Tony, you will come back safely. Just like that, Pepper continued to walk back and forth, but as time went by, Pepper's face became more and more pale, and even a tear appeared in the corner of her eyes. Boom! At this moment, a mirror in the hall flashed, and Tony fell heavily out of the mirror. Tony, are you okay? Seeing Tony fall heavily to the ground, Pepper ran over in panic and picked Tony up. Oh, no, Tony, why is your chest full of blood? Looking at Tony in front of her, who was covered in blood, Pepper couldn't help but shed tears. This made Tony, who was in pain all over his body, feel warm in his heart. He stretched out his right hand tremblingly and wiped away the tears on Pepper's face. Don't cry, Pepper, this sample. It's not beautiful anymore. Hearing this, little Chili said with a hint of tears. Yeah, I won't cry, Tony, hold on, I'll take you to the hospital now. Pepper was about to pick Tony up. But Tony stopped her and said to her. Don't. Pepper, I'm like this. Status. Cannot go. Hospital, my injury is too severe this time, there is no way. Can't hide it, all this will. Exposed. Looking at Tony who wanted to hide everything even at this moment, Pepper said crying. Tony, you are so seriously injured now, you can't delay any longer. When he said this, Pepper couldn't stop crying again. Seeing this, Tony weakly smiled at Pepper, gave her a thumbs up, and said. It's okay, Pepper, the giant bull will heal my current injuries. Just help me back to bed. I'll recover after a rest. You can go to work as usual tomorrow. After hearing this, Pepper could only help Tony up helplessly and slowly helped him to the bed. Watching Tony fall asleep on the bed, Pepper half squatted on the ground, covering her face with her hands, crying silently. After a long time, Pepper stood up and began to clean up the blood and garbage in the villa. When everything was over, she returned to Tony's room. Just like that, Pepper fell asleep beside Tony. Mirror World. In a dimly lit bar. After a big battle with Tony Stark, the wasp monster turned back into a monster and returned to the bar tiredly. He wanted to rest in the bar and go out again to hunt Lindo tomorrow morning to complete this game mission. But before the wasp monster who had just walked into the bar could say anything, he was grabbed by the arm by the Rose girl who had been waiting for a long time and asked. Where is your counting bracelet? When he heard Rose's fingerprint, the wasp man's face changed. After struggling for a while, he could only say helplessly. It was knocked down by Kamen Rider Tepe. After hearing this, Rose handed a new counting bracelet to Wasp Monster and said. The previous kill count is invalid and will be recalculated. The time remains unchanged. You have 1 day left. Upon hearing this, the Wasp man was shocked and asked, why is it invalid? The counting bracelet represents the number of kills you have made. If it is lost, then your number of kills will naturally be lost as well. At this point, the Rose girl looked at the Wasp man coldly and said. This is the rule. After hearing this, the Wasp monster could only stop his dissatisfaction, but he knew that it was too difficult to kill 90 people in 1 day according to the rules of the game. If he really wanted to do this, then his game would definitely end in failure. He could only say to the Rose girl. Then can I use Kamen Rider Tepe to replace the number of kills? Rose girl heard this and thought for a moment before answering. Yes, one Kamen Rider can replace 40 people. After hearing this, the Wasp monster finally nodded with satisfaction, put the counting bracelet back on his arm, and said fiercely. T-Bing, let me take you back to the west tomorrow morning. Early in the morning. In Tony Stark's villa. Tony Stark slowly opened his eyes. Seeing Pepper sleeping on a stool, he felt warm inside. He stared at Pepper for a long time before stopping. Then, Tony stood up carefully, obviously wanting to make less noise so as not to wake up Pepper who was sleeping soundly. Hiss, hiss. Tony still underestimated his injuries. Although he had recovered a lot after a whole night of healing by the giant bull contracted beast, he was still not healed. He didn't feel anything when he was asleep just now, but when Tony stood up and wanted to move, he felt waves of pain in his chest, making Tony hiss. This woke up Pepper, who was sleeping soundly beside him. Pepper had fallen asleep tiredly, but when she heard Tony's familiar voice, she woke up instantly. When Pepper opened her eyes and saw that Tony wanted to get up by himself, she stood up quickly. She walked to Tony's side, supported him, and said softly, "Tony, be careful, your injury is not healed yet, continue to sleep for a while, you need some water, I'll get it for you." After saying that, she supported Tony's back to the bed, turned around and poured a cup of hot water, and handed it to Tony. During the whole process, Tony was not given a chance to speak. Tony could only awkwardly take the cup of water handed over by Pepper, took a small sip, and then spoke. "Pepper, don't be so nervous. I'm almost recovered now." But before Tony could finish his words, Pepper interrupted him mercilessly and said, "You don't have to say anything today. I have arranged all the work for today last night. You have only one mission today, that is to have a good rest, and don't think about fighting monsters, and if you want to, you have to wait until you recover first." Hearing Pepper talking to him seriously, although Tony showed an impatient look on his face. But at this moment, Tony felt warm in his heart, a feeling of being cared for so much. Tony hasn't enjoyed it for more than 10 years, although Tony really wanted to listen to Pepper's words at this moment. But thinking that the wasp monster yesterday was not destroyed, it will definitely come out to do evil today. By that time, there will definitely be many innocent people who will die at the hands of this group of monsters. Thinking of this, Tony's mind sank, and he could only helplessly argue with Pepper. "Pepper, I just want to go to the bathroom. You can't let me sleep in bed all the time." Hearing Tony's explanation, Pepper could only nod helplessly, then pointed at Tony and said, "Yes, but you must promise not to leave secretly." Promise, I will never leave." Looking at Tony's solemn promise on the bed, Pepper could only help Tony get up. In this way, Pepper supported Tony and walked to the bathroom step by step. Seeing that Tony had only walked a few steps, his face turned pale with pain. Pepper's eyes could not help but turn red again. Tony on the side noticed that Pepper's expression had changed. He joked, "It's okay, Pepper, with my current body, I will be as active as a bull in 2 days." As he said that, Tony deliberately straightened his chest, wanting to prove to Pepper that he was almost well. But before Tony could hold on for long, the pain in his chest made Tony bend over again, and his whole face was twisted with pain. Seeing this, Pepper hurriedly stopped Tony's behavior and said seriously, "Tony, you are injured now, so you should act like an injured person, don't be funny." Hearing this, Tony had no choice but to stop. Soon, Pepper helped Tony to the bathroom door. Survey result reply. As for Loki, it has been confirmed that it is Yao Kui. After all, compared to a magician, my impression of Loki is more of a double-blade assassin who uses illusions for close combat. As for Thor, there are 2 that have not been confirmed yet. One is Da Ya. I really want to see the scene where Thor fights with a hammer in one hand and an axe in the other. The other is Booming Ghost from Hibiki. After all, he is a rare Kamen Rider with thunder attribute, which meets the requirements of Thor. What do you think? Thanks for watching.